So basically, from going from west to east, you have the flow of Italian Jews who settled or were expelled and arrived in the Greek peninsula. So they came in the Ionian Islands, they came, let's say, to the Venetian Empire. If Salonika, for example, became Ottoman in 1453, so the Italian Jewish communities, which in general predated the Sephardim in Salonika, came immediately at the time of the expulsions. So since, for example, Sicily was under the Castilian or Spanish kingdom, that was also part of the expulsion wave. So, for example, in the beginning of January 1493, the Jews were expelled from Sicily. Before that, you had Jews from Sicily and Apulia who settled in the Ionian Islands in the west of Greece, in Corfu and those places. But only when there was the expulsions at the end of the 15th century did they settle in the region of Epirus, which the biggest city was Ioannina. But in the beginning, let's say in the 1490s, the most distinct phenomenon of Italian Jewish congregations was in Arta, which is south of Ioannina, and also Istanbul. But in Arta, for example, you had Jews from all sorts of places. There were several synagogues and of various places of origin, from Corfu, from Sicily, from Calabria, and Apulia, each one jealously preserving its religious autonomy. The juxtaposition of such diverse cultural elements gave rise to conflicting concepts of ethics and customs, reflected in the numerous disputes and congregational regulations issued during the 16th and 17th centuries. One subject of heated controversy was whether a bridegroom is permitted to visit the home of his betrothed, of course, before the wedding. So first we're going to talk about Salonika, and then we'll go back and talk about Ioannina, which was in the west. So in Salonika, we have the most amount of Italian Jewish diverse congregations. They're essentially independent communities, not just a synagogue. So an independent community had a yeshiva. It had usually its own printing press. It even had a fabric industry. It had its own schools, its own Talmud Torah, its own treasury, its own philanthropic organizations for the poor, etc., etc. With time that became too expensive, so the community amalgamated. In Ioannina, which was known as the Romaniot community, the Judeo-Greek speaking Byzantine Greek Jews, there also, in the beginning, at the end of the 15th century, there were Sicilian Jews. We don't know, there wasn't a synagogue per se that was called Sicilian, but even until the Holocaust, there were Sicilian customs practiced by Ioannina Jews. So those who claim that they came from Sicily, for example, they had their own Purim 5 days before the regular Purim. Now, what is the story? They call their Purim Katan, the little Purim, in the city of Syracuse, or Siracosa, in Sicily, not Saragossa in Spain. Basically, the Jews had relations with the king, okay? And the king, his name was Saracosanos, he would go to the market and the Jews greeted him with a Sefer Torah. There was one Jew named Marcos who was a provocateur, okay? And he wanted, I think the legend goes that he wanted to show that there actually was no Sefer Torah in the box, in the market. Okay, and that he wanted to libel the Jews by saying that, no, they tricked the king. And so, at first, the king believed Marcos. And so he was going to threaten to kill the Jews because they insulted and they were devious and they tricked the king. In the end, the libel backfired on Marcos, and it all came out to the king that Marcos lied, and so that the Marcos in the end was hung. But it's a typical story how the Jews survived a plot to kill them, just like Haman wanted to do to the Jews in Shushan and in Persia. And so there were many instances of many Jewish communities in the spring survived annihilation, so they had their own Purim ceremonies. And another version of the Purim, which wasn't 5 days before Purim, it was earlier, was called Siciliani, or in Greek, Purimopoulou, which was celebrated on the 17th of Shvat in January or February, depending on how it played out according to the regular calendar. So this festival, Sman Purims, or Purim Katans, and it was celebrated by these, we'll call them Byzantine Jews all over. The question of, is this Siciliano or the Purim of Syracuse, what is the origin? Or is there a Sephardic version called Purim Saragossa? For example, in Corfu, you had two Apulian synagogues. You had an Apulian synagogue and a Apulian Aragon. What that really means is the Jews were originally from Aragon, probably after they were expelled in 1391, and they made it to southern Italy. Okay, and then they were expelled again at the end of the 15th or beginning of the 16th century. They made it to Epirus. Okay, so it also could be that some origin was from a Sephardic Saragossa. Okay, but as you'll see in the interview with Artemis, she claimed by the story that she knew that it was from Saragossa. Okay, so you also have the Purim of Syracuse or Saragossa. It was observed also in Sephardic communities, but in Yanina they had a different version. So they claimed that the version was Sicilian, and for example, families with the last name Betzika or Eliezer or Cantos were considered to be Sicilian in origin. There was a community member named Melius, whose family name was Cantos, and they traced their origin to Sicily. Two reports from the Alliance Israélite Universelle teachers in Yanina in the early 20th century thoroughly detail the legend which recounts the events which are remembered in the annual celebration. So in both accounts, the apostate Jew is compared to his counterpart in the Purim of Esther. And then in the report of February 8, 1912, the Alliance director noted that there were 50 families in Yanina from Sicilian origin that celebrated Purim. And 2 years later, 30 families celebrated their holiday of the Sicilian Purim on the 24th of Shvat. If you notice, the dates change, even the Hebrew dates. The first Purim I told you about was the 17th of Shvat, and this other Sicilian Purim was the 24th of Shvat, and we don't know what the difference is, and it's only speculation. So, for example, in 1914, in Yanina, the Megillah for Purim was read. Remember, this is before Purim at any rate, but it's this special Sicilian Purim. Later in the day, visits were made and presents exchanged. Because the primary Hebrew teacher, Chacham Davos, was Sicilian, the students went to his house to celebrate. Merchants who were Sicilian also closed their stores for the holiday. And it's good they call it Purimopoulou, the minor Purim. And that holiday, my father said, was Sicilian. So they called it Siciliano. In that holiday, people went to the synagogue in the morning, and then they came home, and they had sweets, and they drank raki, like a rock, the strong drink. They had a special breakfast. Later in the afternoon, they had a special meal, and that was their custom. So this guy who was called Melius, him and 5 or 6 families, they observed this Siciliano Purim, and a woman named Annetta Melius, she traced her family back as Sicilian. There's a few other versions, which there's no point in saying, but the Romanio Jews in Yanina, they had Ir Tamar. I think it's a different origin, but it's basically the same thing.